The big corporations are all benefiting from the genocide, not just in Palestine, but also in Sudan, the silent genocide no one speaks about. Many places, I mean, the military economy is the way in which the shareholder profit grows. And this is something that I think right now more than ever, we need to be able to say, capitalism and humanity just don't fit together.
A rising radical right, political polarisation, downward mobility of the middle class. I'm talking, of course, about the 2020s, but we've been here before, namely a century ago. It didn't end well. You might already know that. But references to fascism, World War II, Hitler, Mussolini can sometimes feel dated or even excessive. Today's guest would disagree, however. Her PhD was on the connection between liberal economics, liberal economic theory, and the rise of fascism. She says that austerity programs and pushing down wages were the things that generated fascism and what followed. She also contends we're returning to that world. In fact, we're more than a decade into something which seems, potentially in Europe anyway, like a rerun. So what is liberal economics and what is its relationship to fascism? Is capitalism even possible running alongside democracy? Or are these two systems which simply can't work together? All important conversations and all tied up in a new book published by Clara Mattei, Escape From Capitalism, Economics Is Political, and Other Liberating Truths. Clara Mattei, welcome to Downstream.
Thank you for having me.
Who are you?
Let's
start from the top.
So I'm the author of the book we're discussing today called Escape From Capitalism, Economics Is Political and Other Liberating Truths. I'm a professor of economics. I teach in the US. I was teaching in New York, and now I moved to Tulsa, Oklahoma. And the reason is that I also started with other members of the group, the Forum for Real Economic Emancipation, or FREE. So freeforum.org is where you can get more information of what we do, but essentially it is an attempt to re-democratize our economy, take action in what is right now an economic system that is really not working for people, and it's not designed to work for people. So a conversation about why we need to change our perspective and our narrative about the economy, and also how concretely we can participate through assemblies for a different economic system. And this is what we're trying to experiment with in Tulsa with the Forum for Real Economic Emancipation.
So this is your sort of second big book. Your first one was 2022, Capital Order?
Yes.
Which is really interesting. This is short-ish, but it's very wide-ranging. And your PhD was on the relationship between sort of austerity and the rise of Italian fascism.
Yes, indeed.
Which we'll talk about later on. Really fascinating, and that runs right through this book. I just want to start at the top, though, with regards to your more recent work. What is the capital order?
The capital order is an invisible order which traps us all and is the foundation of what people call the market economy or the free market. And what I tried to say is that the free market is actually deeply rooted in the most unfree of all relations, which is the wage-labor relation. That is how growth happens under capitalism, how we accumulate money, is because most of us have basically given up agency into the production process, into deciding what we do during our day, because we're usually producing value for someone else, our employer, and we don't really get to choose what happens. And, even people working for Google, when Google is making deals with ICE or with the Israeli military to bomb Palestinian children, you don't have very many options. If you want to keep that job, you got to do what they tell you. And the bottom line is that you are working for the profit of big corporations.
So that's just basically capitalism, right?
Yeah.
You're saying wage labor, production for exchange.
So that's the thing, is that focusing on the capital order wants to stress how capitalism is not spontaneous or natural, but is based on a political coercion that is reinforced and really enabled by state intervention. So the big point is to say that this is not a natural state of affairs. You need constant political force to make sure people have no option but to go work for a wage. And at the other hand, you need to make sure that governing institution protect those few investors who are gaining from our system. I think right now I know right now we are in the most obscene and unprecedented moment in terms of inequality and inequality levels that are represented by the fact that poverty rates keep going up. In the UK alone, we have 1 out of 3 children who are in poverty, while billionaires have increased 6-fold since 2014. In the globe, we have 12 people who own more than the bottom 50% of the global population. That is 4 billion people. These are Oxfam data points that you can find easily. 12 people, literally 12 people own more than 4 billion people. And, half of the world lives off of $6.85 a day. So we are in a situation in which literally we have 2 billion people who are food insecure. This means that literally people go hungry, while that at the very, very top, accumulation has never been so abundant and so strong.
That's an incredible statistic about 12 people versus what you said, 4 billion?
4 billion.
So 50% of the planet's population.
Yes, this is the last statistics. If you look at Oxfam, the reports of Oxfam on inequality, this is one of their statistics that I just read the other day. So it's about right now. So in the last couple of years, the wealth of the top has escalated.
Yeah. I mean, it's probably worse than that now, right? Because Elon Musk's personal fortune is like $750 billion now, his paper fortune anyway.
Yes.
Which is crazy. I mean, what do you think of Elon Musk? And I don't want to get personal about it, but, when I was a kid growing up, the idea that there would be trillion-dollar companies was just outlandish, let alone trillionaires. But it seems like he's certainly on course to get there before 2030 at this rate.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. And he's one of others. The other statistics that this is the Washington Post saying that 19 people in the United States have actually accumulated almost $2 trillion in the past 2 years. While we know that in the United States, actually, we have half of the households who are financially insecure, and almost 77% of workers who can't afford their paycheck to be delayed by 1 week. Not to mention homelessness, health crisis of all sorts, because people can't pay for their health care and people die because of this. So it's a very, very violent economic system, right? It really does seem like we are seeing the Hobbesian state of nature of all against all, but the state of nature is constructed. Hobbes had that as an abstraction, but it really does in many ways represent what our capitalist economy looks like today.
So when one says that capitalism is a contingent social system, it's historically contingent, that doesn't mean much to most people. So if I'm on GB News, which is this country's version of Fox News, and I say capitalism is a contingent social system, or if I say it on BBC Radio 4, 99% of people have no idea what I'm talking about. In layman's terms, what does that sentence or that explanation mean?
It means that there's nothing eternal or spontaneous to it. It means that it is built on political forces that can, by definition, be changeable, especially if people open up their eyes to the fact that this system is never meant to have to have the majority win. The system is constructed. So the story we know is that, if we don't do well, it's probably our fault. We haven't tried hard enough. We are somehow irrational, because this is what the economic models tell you, that actually the redistribution of income mirrors our talents and our capacities to choose the right options. This is a complete myth. Our economic system is based on the relation of exploitation. And this relation of exploitation means that, by definition, we produce more value than what we get in our paycheck. And this is the source of it all. And also, it means that this relation of exploitation is something that needs certain historical conditions to work. And the historical conditions are that people need to be made more market dependent. This is what austerity does. Austerity policies about cutting social expenditures and imposing more taxes on workers rather than on capital gains, and increasing the rate of unemployment through interest rates that we can discuss, through interest rates hikes. This is all meant to preserve those historical conditions that maintain capitalism in place. So the message here, I think, is empowering, because if you start looking at capital as a social relation rather than just money. Money is just the surface representation of the social relation. The social relation is very historical and very contingent. And by contingent, I mean that it really does require certain power balances, that given that these power balances are to the detriment of the majority, the global majority, they could be changed if people, thought that they could have the power to take agency back.
I hope you're enjoying this conversation as much as I am having it with Clara. Fantastic, fantastic person to talk to. You might know about, of course, this show regularly on Sunday. I presume you do. You're watching it after all. You might know the fact we do events as well. What you might not be aware of, however, is the fact we have a Downstream newsletter direct to your inbox every Sunday. It includes some of the anecdotes, the tidbits, the reading recommendations, which don't make the final cut. If you'd like to get that every week sent straight to you, go to novara.media/downstream newsletter. Join our Downstream revolution. So I'm a Marxist, just to be clear. And what you're talking about, I totally agree with regards to alienated surplus value. And that's the source of profit. But somebody watching this, which is to say, by the way, if you're working and you earn £15 an hour, there's an extra £2 or £3 which is going to somebody else, and that's the basis of their profit. Somebody might be watching or listening to this and thinking, okay, makes sense. In certain contexts, I can understand that. I see it. I've lived it. However, when I walk down my high street, my local pharmacy is giving 50 people a methadone script. They're recovering drug addicts. I see kids being sent to school. In this country, we have SEND kids. They might have certain disability, psychological disability, mental health issues, range of things, anxiety, ADHD, whatever. But 500,000 kids get taxis to school. They see repeatedly the state intervening in things which aren't the labour relation, which don't help maximise profit. And this is often cast as, what everyone's thoughts on this, as waste or excessive spending or, goodwill, but it ultimately, doesn't actually help the people at the receiving end. Whatever, park it. That, to most people, is how they view the state, rightly or wrongly, and that doesn't sort of cohere with what you're saying about the relationship between the state, markets, and capitalism. What would you say to that person?
I would say that this is what mainstream media wants you to see. What the mainstream media wants you to see is this idea that, the state wastes money on undeserving people who could, toughen up and find a job and not weigh on society. This is part of the problem, is the way in which we see the world is constructed and fabricated by those elite who don't want us to see what actually happens, and the way in which the majority of those resources that are taxed from people, and this is very important, is that people produce that value. They don't get to keep the majority of that value, right? Because it just gets siphoned away, most of it, by the way, now into the hands of asset managers that are not even local capitalists anymore. Then there is the fact that it's people who are disproportionately taxed, right? This is regressive taxation. Again, wages are taxed in the paycheck, so you don't see that money even coming in. Well, we know that inheritance tax is almost abolished everywhere. We have corporate taxation that keep going down. We have capital that is investment. The reason why Elon Musk is so rich, or someone like Bezos is so rich, is because they don't need to sell their shares. And so these shares keep accumulating and they're never taxed. And by the way, if they die, their children will get that money without even being taxed. So de facto, the very rich are untaxed. And this is something that we've just had a very cool conversation that you can find on our YouTube channel with the Forum for Real Economic Emancipation. We just had a tax lawyer who's actually part of these patriotic millionaires, they're called. It's a group of very wealthy people in the US who actually lobby at Capitol Hill for more progressive taxes. Progressive taxes means that those at the top should actually pay a greater share of their income with respect to those at the bottom. Right now, it's exactly the reversed. So this tax lawyer, Bob Lord, really shows very clearly in his analysis all the ways in which not only the United States system, but all the Westerns, not just the Western countries, most countries around the world have a very, very regressive taxation system. So you produce that value is taken away from you. The one that it remains is getting taxed. disproportionately. And then the point is that also this tax money, it doesn't actually get back to you in terms of social services, because we know social services are constantly depleted. And this money, you don't know where it goes, but what happens is that the state uses it to de-risk, incentivize, fund private investors. And right now, what we're seeing is an acceleration of money being spent in the military sector. And the point is that militarism is actually crucial to the functioning of capitalism, because it is the best way for the state to stimulate an economy without risking the potential political empowerment that comes with social services. So if you cut social services, this is actually good for our economic system, because it makes us weaker in terms of finding space to find alternative ways of existing that is not the wage labor. So I think this is the point, is that actually, if you look at how the state spends the money, it's on debt, so debt repayment, and this is how global South countries spend the majority of their resources, actually on paying back the interest on debt. And so that's also part of the book tries to describe, is the fact that what we have in Western countries is also based on a lot of extraction of wealth from the global South. I have the data saying that $65 billion are siphoned out of Africa every year for the past 26 years. So $65 billion, this is much more than what the money in aid comes, the money of aid that comes in. So this is the whole point, is that, the state pays that interest on debt, spends on militarism, spends on surveillance, spends on subsidizing private investment. This is the invisible part of the expenditures that is rarely discussed, while the point is always to point the finger to those who are at the very bottom of society, as if that's the problem is them. The problem is not them. The problem is actually the very few that benefit from a system that is flourishing at the expense of humanity.
The thing is, many are at the bottom of the system, but I know a guy who went to Harrow School. I went to a state school, right? But I know a guy who went to Harrow School, very wealthy family, and because of his dyslexia, for instance, he got thousands of pounds worth of laptops. He could study longer in exams and whatnot. Now, why am I saying this? Because right now we have billions in this country spent on send provision for young people, kids in a similar situation. Now, again, it's not about whether or not you disagree with that. That's maybe something the state should be doing. But that doesn't make sense if you're looking at it through the prism of state expenditures are about helping the privileged few and it's about repressing everybody else. In this country, actually, lower middle income earners get a reasonable deal. You don't pay tax on the first £12,500, right? In Sweden, it's, I think, the first €2,000, basically. So you're not paying much in tax. You get child benefit. You get free nursery and childcare. You get NHS. You get policing. You probably don't pay student fees. I'm giving you defence that a politician would make, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas actually, if you look at somebody who's on, say, £50,000, £60,000, they don't get lots of that stuff. Their kids, if they want to go and become a medical student at university, have to get £100,000 worth of debt. So this kind of prism to me of the most sort of neglected, put upon people in society being the very poorest, or even the lower middle class, for me, increasingly, it doesn't tally with reality. Like the people who are being proletarianized and crushed at a record pace, it seems to me, are the middle class. And I'm not saying that because it's my background. My father's a taxi driver, right? My mother was a cleaning lady. But just the last 15 years, if I'm looking at who's really suffering, comparatively, obviously, they're not suffering in absolute terms, it's those people. And that to me, and we'll talk about this later, about the rise of fascism, that to me is the recipe for fascism, right? If you're seeing this crushing of the European middle class, and it really is happening at extraordinary pace now, particularly since 2022, I really worry. And I think a lot of the left doesn't have the intellectual tools to make sense of that, because the repressed are always out there. It's the people who are, really, really destitute. And many of those people, of course, but they're not the main political agents when you see the rise of fascism historically, right? It's the petty bourgeois. It's the frustrated middle class entrepreneur.
But this is the thing, is that I think there is just a bad way of understanding class in our society. Again, that middle class is part of the working class. That middle class does make the majority of their income off of wages. This is the point. It's not about the money in the bank account. It's not about the social status, about like your education. It's really about your positioning in the production process. And those middle classes don't make a living off of capital investment. Maybe they have a little bit of money investment. The majority of their income is coming out of wage labor that is getting constantly, substituted with machines, and now we'll see more and more of that. It's getting cut and compressed. Labor becomes more precarious. The same austerity produces mass impoverishment, also of those who consider themselves the middle class. And I think this is the key, is that, in the global South, austerity hits workers, I think, in a way that is different from us, because workers in the global South really have really often never had access to any social benefits because of the colonial and imperial nature of our economic system. But in our country, also in Italy, the reality is that many people can't. I mean, I don't know here in the UK, I don't have the specifics, but I can tell you that in Italy, many people that could rely on the national health system are now increasingly either not. 1 out of 4 is actually refraining from getting health cures because it's either too expensive or too long of a wait. So this fact that these services are getting lesser and lesser, and this middle class is suffering, is a reality around the whole of the West. And I know also in the UK. The UK's economic system, the money went to bailing out the banks. It goes to, again, securing the asset manager, the financial investors. It does not go to the people. Now you can say maybe those are the very, very bottom, have some form of social service that helps them out. Thank God. By the way, in the United States, it's not even that way.
No.
So again, there's we're at different moments of the acceleration of the same trend. In the United States, many of our assembly members are unhoused, barely get food stamps. Now Trump is part of the austerity measures of Trump is actually to cut $200 billion in the next 10 years on food assistance, and not to mention $500 billion on Medicaid. And you know where that money is going? For the military, the defense. That is actually almost going to touch, he wants to get to $1 trillion for defense in 2027, right? So we are, and that's unprecedented in terms of number. So I think the point here is that we need to have a more systemic and global understanding of what is happening. And I think the trend that you see in the UK is a trend that is happening both in other countries in the global north, including, by the way, places like Sweden, Iceland, that everyone describes as this haven of, welfareism. I was invited both in Iceland and in Sweden. Actually, they translated my book in Sweden because they are very much suffering because of austerity policies. And when I talk about austerity, I mean, again, cuts in social expenditures. It's not about whether the state spends or not. It's where the state spends.
Yeah.
It's not whether the state taxes or not. This is very important. People are like, oh, you're rising taxes. It's not about increasing taxes. It's about who you're increasing taxes on. So everyone's against tax increases. But the point is that our state increases the taxes on consumption goods, which hit the workers, and never on really the money, those who are actually systematically detaxed at the top. And then it's about privatization, so what I call industrial austerity, labor deregulation, so ways to compress wages that, for example, even Icelandic unions have to deal with. And then, of course, increases in interest rates that produces a lot more unemployment. So these policies are everywhere, even in the supposed socialist havens that are actually targeted by the same policies. So we need to figure out how these policies do impoverish the so-called middle class. That is not real. I mean, middle class, again, I don't think it has a lot of scientific value in calling it middle class, because again, we need to see actually where you stand in the social relations. And once you find that out, you realize that this system does polarize society. And it's interesting because, people thought, oh, Marx was didn't see it right because, once labor productivity went up, you could have rising wages and rising profits, and so inequality could shrink. That was something that happened for a very, very limited time period between the 50s and the 70s, basically, 20, 25 years. The reality is that this long-term tendency law that Marx saw is real. It is a polarizing
tendency
system.
of the rate of profit to fall.
The tendency of the polarization of society.
Right.
The fact that actually as wealth accumulates, the scissor increases and like people like start to suffer. That was something that was considered something that Marx didn't get right. But if you think about the fact that he talks about tendency laws, meaning that again, there's nothing deterministic in Marxian analysis at all. It's all about like political forces. In certain moments, workers can fight back and avoid losing so much of the share of the GDP in favor of profits. But the point is that in what we're seeing today is kind of the realization of the doomed story that Marx was describing, in the sense that the society is really polarizing and this middle class is losing all it has. And thus, of course, because of the type of models that circulate, blaming it on the weakest rather than on the top.
I mean, it's a rough time being a leftist at the moment because you're being proved right on so many things. I saw a graph recently about industrial production for Germany just going down. The car industry's dying. Chinese electric vehicles are coming. Cheap Russian energy's gone. And then all of a sudden, we're going to build tanks. Taking off. And it's exactly the analysis you would have heard from German social democrats before the First World War, from Engels, from Lenin, from Marx, like you say. There's a crisis of underconsumption. And the state seeks to mediate demand through military budgets and military spending. That's the first thing. And it's happening. And I do sort of worry. You go on X and you see people cheering on German rearmament, Japanese rearmament. And you think, okay, the last time this happened, it wasn't so good. And on the social democracy thing, I think this is really, really important. This didn't really occur to me until I went to Denmark maybe 10 years ago. And, in Britain, the left is still weak, but it was much weaker. This was maybe 15 years ago, actually. It was much weaker 15 years ago. And there wasn't much for left to speak of, really. And I went to Denmark and I saw, small left-wing parties like the Green Left. You met anarchists. You could go to housing cooperatives and communes. And they'd just gotten rid of a great place called the Ungdomshuset. But it was a really flourishing leftist scene in Denmark. And what I realized was this was only possible because of social democracy. Because people had a 35-hour week, because they had stable housing, because they didn't have student debt, because they could get decent paying jobs with unions and collective bargaining, blah, 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 that gave the surplus time to create a flourishing left culture. Whereas in Britain, we didn't have that. And so it didn't exist. And to me, it was like a light bulb moment because, until then I thought, flourishing social democracy makes a radical left impossible. But actually, it's the complete opposite. A radical left really can only flourish, actually, when you've got a flourishing social democracy. Dying social democracy, which kind of is of a piece with I presume your PhD. You talk about this as a major theme in the book. Social democracy in crisis and austerity doesn't open up the possibilities to the radical left.
Right.
Historically, yeah. Right? It forecloses them.
Absolutely. And this is exactly the point, is that what you see is that austerity propels more austerity, which again, this is important, this is not irrational for capitalism. Austerity works for capitalism. I think this is a point I tried to make through the historical analysis also of my other book, The Capital Order, is to show that austerity is a key element of the capitalist economy. And this is, of course, related to the idea that the capitalist economy is not spontaneous. It requires constant state intervention to maintain it in place. And the way the state maintains capitalism in place is through good dosages of austerity. And why is that? It's because exactly what you said is that if market dependence is limited, people find spaces of collective organization that risk pressuring the state institutions to potentially go beyond the political limits of capitalism. And this is important. Capitalism cannot work if wealth is distributed to the people. Radical redistribution of income, welfarism in a real sense, is not compatible with a capitalist economy. And this is something that, now I'm studying The Economist under the Johnson administration. So the moment of the Great Society in the United States, right? The only moment in which basically there was at least an attempt to prioritize unemployment and to help the very, very poor. in a society in which, a fourth of the population during the so-called golden age was in deep poverty in the US, and of course, mostly hitting Black workers. But the point is that even in these historical moments, these economists realized that if you gave people power through, for example, they were running these local agencies to try to promote local participation in how the resources were distributed. This was a horrendous deal for capitalism because it actually motivated people to stand up with the so-called riots. We remember them as the Detroit, New York riots. These riots were really just moments of political empowerment, and people were demanding a different economic system. So this is the whole point, is that if the state gives too much, and this is what I also show happened after the First World War, the state gives more, potentially because people demand more. By giving more, you risk breaking that market dependence that is so crucial to maintain people disciplined and in their place, not questioning the foundation of the system. So that's the thing, is like welfare reform is potentially politically dangerous for capitalism. And this is, we need to understand, this is a political limit of our system. You can't have capitalism and a great welfare state, because this welfare state is potentially what triggers greater empowerment, and thus, and this, this was the argument that Michael Kalecki made about unemployment too. He was criticizing Keynes because he was telling Keynes, hey, Keynes, you think you can have happy workers, happy capitalists, no unemployment, but still maintain private investment at the center of how at the center of how you run the economy, right? The engine remains private investment. Kalecki told him, well, that's maybe technically possible, but it's definitely not politically possible, because if there is no unemployment, workers would achieve that bargaining power they need to question why they're not in charge and the employers are, right? To question why they have no say over what they do during the workday and someone else does. So this is the whole point, is that unemployment not only is a consequence of the system, right? So unemployment is produced by real competition under capitalism itself. But this unemployment is also a solution for our system. If unemployment is too low, this is a very big problem, because then people start mobilizing, and this is risky. And this has happened right after COVID. In my research, I look at what happened during the Red Biennium after the First World War, which was, of course, much more revolutionary. But even after COVID in the United States, a third of the workforce quit voluntarily. And a lot of unions got empowered. Strikes were everywhere. People were winning battles. And in the US, this hadn't happened really since the 70s. And this was because unemployment levels had gotten down to lower than, it was like 3.4%, which is still 5.7 million people unemployed. So we're still talking about a lot of unemployed people. And this is, by the way, only people who are actively searching for the job. So it doesn't even count all those millions who have given up and are just destitute. But the point is that even 5.7 million people officially unemployed is dangerous for the system, because it's still too low of a number, because the labor market, as economists tell us, is very tight, in the sense that, there were 2 job openings for every 1 unemployed person, and this hadn't happened in forever, and this had a political consequence. So I'm trying to say here is that the economy is much more political than we think, political in the real sense of being founded upon relations of power. And these relations of power can change according to the historical moment. And clearly the point is that austerity is there to make sure that these crisis moments are avoided. And when I talk about crisis, I really mean this like political crisis of those who are subordinate, trying to achieve a different social role. And so that's the whole point, is to say austerity is not just irrational policy making like a lot of Keynesian would tell you.
Yes, we talked about the First World War. Obviously, there's the Second World War as well, this golden age, and then you're talking about the post-COVID thing. And just to return to this idea that social democracy creates possibilities beyond it, I remember being, again, 15, 20 years ago, you'd hear people on the ultra left saying, no, social democracy is a sort of bourgeois deviation from the real revolutionary politics. And I look at the last 15 years, and that's obviously just nonsense. Lenin was a quote-unquote social democrat until the First World War. And that's just obviously ridiculous. And then I look at austerity really in this country since 2010, and it's actually cartoonish how much George Osborne as Chancellor approximates what you're talking about. He comes in, VAT goes up, they cut corporation tax, they get rid of the top rate of tax, they make loads of cuts to state spending in some places, increase it in others. They cut, local authorities spending by 40%. Cartoonishly, austerian. It didn't work. I mean, it didn't work. It probably worked by virtue of what you're trying to say, or what you are saying. It didn't work by, it didn't boost aggregate demand. It didn't boost growth. It created a political crisis, which culminated in Brexit and still going on. We're going to get Nigel Farage as Prime Minister. And yet, even now, 15 years later, it's almost impossible to have that political conversation, which I find remarkable. You say, look, these policies you did are now taking us to a place where we've left the European Union, and that's just the start of it, ultimately. Ultimately, the end point of all of this is some kind of state breakdown, probably the fragmentation of the UK, because places like Scotland and Wales will rationally say, I don't want to be a part of this. And yet, the framing of austerity as uniquely depraved and counterproductive, even just from a sort of liberal social democratic perspective, if that's what the BBC even is anymore, is stupid and backwards looking. Now, let's go back in history to make sense of this. You're Italian. Your PhD is on the relationship between austerity after the First World War and the rise of fascism. So what happens to European workers after World War I? How do they change? How does their consciousness change?
So this is, I think, a key example of how we can, puncture capitalism and potentially see social transformation. In that moment, there was a real crisis of our capitalist economy because of how to try to really, win the war and defeat the enemy, capitalist states did intervene like they had never done before during the war. And this really politicized, or in other words, denaturalized the two pillars of capitalism. People saw that wage labor was imposed by the state. People ended up in prison in Italy if they didn't show up for work. So it was clear that, exploitation was very real and very political. Same for private investment. People saw that central planning had actually worked during the war. And so this problematization of these pillars, combined with the fact that workers had experienced new forms of association during the war. Very famously, in Italy, we had the workers' councils that were formed as committees already during the war to oppose the super exploitation that was coming from the state. And this really created a momentum for the cry was that of self-governance, of self-management, workers self-managing. And also in the countryside, peasants were taking on the land and running it through assemblies. So it was a moment in which people were demanding participation in the economy and the overcoming of the pillars of wage labor and private means of production. So here it's when you see how, the Red Biennium was real in the West. It wasn't just Soviet Russia. So this was true also in Britain. So my book is actually comparative analysis of Italy and Britain after the war and how austerity was implemented very similarly in these two countries. And what these countries had in common after the war, of course, Britain was, the empire, the hub of capitalist development, was just losing grounds to the US, while Italy was still agricultural, very peripheral in a way, and dependent on the British hegemony. Still, these two countries were experimenting a lot of social mobilization from the below that were very powerful. In Britain also, you had the Sankey Committee in Britain in 1920 was all about nationalizing coal production and organizing coal through self-managing bodies that were actually led by workers themselves. So a moment of extreme creativity in terms of what society after the war could look like. And again, the Capital Order actually spends the whole first part of the book all on these alternatives to capitalism that were emerging at the heart of capitalism, not anywhere else, at the heart of it. And then what you see is that in these both countries, austerity is used as the solution to economic alternatives, because austerity kills these economic alternatives. So in Italy, they did it through Mussolini. And in Britain, they did it through the Bank of England and the Treasury that had, the levers of fiscal and monetary policy, much like today. So it's just like two different ways of taking care of the same problem, which was kind of workers demanding a little bit too much.
So Britain used, to get to the sort of core of the book, highly politicized fiscal and monetary policy, whereas in Italy it was just brute military political force.
Well, yes, it's slightly more complicated in the sense that in Italy, Benito Mussolini, he clearly, and the book, by the way, both of the books mention the fact, that my great uncle was fighting against the fascist occupation, and he actually committed suicide in prison after being tortured for a whole week by the Nazis that at that point had come into Italy. And he was a partisan, and not to speak, he actually hung himself with shoelaces. So it's a very tragic story in my family. But the point is that what you see is that this cry for liberation, of course, was due to the fact that there was real political repression in Italy that was also very violent. But the reality is that the most effective repression was the economic repression. And this economic repression came into being because Mussolini brought to government economists, professors, the same professors that you now have, advising the various governments in power today, the same economists in the sense that it was the same neoclassical method. It was the same framework that at the time was called pure economics. It was a moment in which economics was repudiating the labor theory of value, the political economy tradition that my book tries to revitalize, and was instead proposing this pure economics framework, which was exactly the idea that economics had nothing to do with history, with institution, with power relation. It had all to do with models that were like syllogisms, deductive and pure and neutral. Well, these neutral models were really a facade to hide classist assumptions that we still use today to understand society, because they were very powerful and they started diffusing at the time. And Mussolini called these economists into power, these pure economists. And this was loved by the Brits. The Brits actually have a whole chapter in the other book, and I mentioned it here too, of how, Montagu Norman, the head of the Bank of England, was saying, we know Mussolini is torturing people. We know there's no freedom of press. But listen, he got savings to increase. Profits are back. We can go back and invest in Italy. Strikes are over. He was the right man at a critical moment. For the pendulum not to swing too far in quite the opposite direction. This is a letter I found at the archives here of the Bank of England. A letter that Montagu Norman had sent to Jack Morgan of the House of Morgan, now Chase Bank, the biggest bank in the world. And both the House of Morgan and the Bank of England were supporting, both ideologically and financially, the fascist regime, because they understood that in Italy the situation was so potentially explosive that you had to have austerity done by someone who had actually the political courage to do it, right? So the technocrats siding with Mussolini were really finding the best of possible worlds for them, because it was this perfect space to implement and experiment with their pure models. They could just implement them because they didn't have to deal with any democratic impediment, right? So it was full on top down. So it's important to note that what was happening in Italy under fascism was actually quite similar to what was happening in Britain as well, because the Bank of England was reaffirming its independence. The Labour Party wanted to nationalize the Bank of England. So there was a big campaign to nationalize the Bank of England around 1924, 1925. And the Bank of England fought very hard to actually, maintain this ideology of independent central banks that they started exporting everywhere else in the globe, in India, in Brazil, everywhere else, the concept of central bank independence, which was really all about de-democratizing economic decision, making sure that people were kept away from decisions to raise interest rates. Why? Because people would not have liked to raise interest rate, because that was going to curtail their political power by increasing unemployment. And so you see, what I try to say is that, technocracy is very authoritarian, and you can use technocracy siding with a fascist government, But you can also use technocracy with supposedly very liberal traditional institutions like the Treasury and the Bank of England.
You know, the older I get, the more I realize that you have these repeated sort of tropes and themes throughout history. So you think something starts in the 90s, and then you think it's the 70s, and then you realize actually it's probably World War One. I'm sure I'll meet somebody at some point and they'll say, oh, this goes actually back to the late 17th century or something.
Yes.
But what you're saying is really analogous to what we see with the Chicago Boys and Pinochet with Chile. The idea that you have a military strongman so that these economists can impose rational technocratic policies. And this is really intriguing that you have Mussolini backed not just by somebody at the Bank of England, but also private finance capital in the United States. I mean, that's really, really extraordinary. And I think about World War One a lot as I get older, because I really get on with some iconoclastic people on the right, one of which is Peter Hitchens. You know, and he is adamant that World War One meant A, the suicide of Europe, but B, it's a lost modernity. You know, the world would just be, you know, we'd be hundreds of years more advanced if we hadn't had the First World War. I mean, we can have counter sort of factual history and whatnot. But I also think that's true for that immediate period following World War One. You know, we could have had a very different kind of modernity. So just to put some meat on the bones with what you're saying about this new, profoundly involved role of the state in the economy during World War One. This is quoting from your book. This is from Edward Lloyd, a civil servant in the British War Ministry. National organisation and centralised control was found to be more effective than high price and laissez-faire in stimulating supply. And then in 1915, Italian economist Riccardo Bacchi, the state as a war entrepreneur has become the centre, the pivot, the engine of the entire economy. And it's funny, you know, when I speak to libertarian economists, I did a literary festival a few years ago, and everyone's a socialist in a crisis. Right, that's one of the big learnings from this as well. When you have the Luftwaffe flying over England in 1940, nobody's saying, you know what, leave it to the market, folks. Leave it to Supermarine and these private firms. No, the state has to mediate production of planes, and the state has to mediate the supply of who's going to go in the planes and the munitions and the radar. Right, so certain crises warrant that role, or even in this country, you know, nuclear weapons. We developed a bomb in Britain between 1945 and 1950 for about half the cost of the Manhattan Project. It was overseen by the Ministry of Supply. So you think extraordinary value for the taxpayer, incredible historical technological innovation, and then they get rid of the ministry. Isn't it curious? And then you fast forward to 2026 and we have Serco and Sodexo and Capita and G4S just splurging money, doing a crap job, and you can't help but think, of course it's intentional, right? Because the Ministry of Supply wasn't making much money for people. Let's talk about some of these economists that were around Mussolini, because again, you know, by training, you're a philosophy and economics person, right?
I did my PhD in economics, and before I studied philosophy for 5 years, yes.
But I mean, there's a lot of history here, right? As
yes.
in economic historian.
You see, not only economics has different methods, also philosophy does. And we know that there's a big distinguishing divide between analytic philosophy, that is what is dominant in the UK or US, and continental philosophy, which is mostly based on historical research. So again, history has been expelled from philosophy, from political philosophy, and from economics. And expelling history is the best way to preserve the status quo, because you eternalize the present, right? You make it all about very abstract individual decisions rather than realizing that our decisions are embedded in a socioeconomic system that is historical and again based on certain political violence. And this is the whole point, is to say, you know, there is no real divide between the state and the market. And I think this is an intuition that is obvious in a certain tradition. You know, you can read someone like Karl Polanyi, but also that was the whole point about Marx, like primitive accumulation, the enclosure of the commons. This is the birth of capitalism, right? It's the idea that you have to expropriate people from their means of subsistence. And how does this expropriation happen? It happens through parliament, through the enclosure acts, through colonialism in the global south, which is all about government intervention. So this is what capitalism starts with. And capitalism starts with state institutions leading the the enclosure of common spaces, right? The elimination of the commons is a political act. There would be no private property. There's nothing spontaneous about private property. There would be no private property if it weren't for laws and then force, law and order, to make sure that private property is protected, right? So this is the whole point, is that capitalism begins when there is a very clear divide between the haves and the have-nots, those who are expelled from their land and then have to move to the city, and great because now they're available to get hired for the new industrial revolution or for the big farms, while the very small minority starts appropriating through investment and through basically returns on investment through and profits and rent. So this is really important, is that you realize that from the very beginning, you wouldn't have the market without the state. And this just continues in different forms. At the end of the day, the original privatization of the commons was a form of austerity, right? It was already a form of austerity. Now, austerity is more visible after the First World War, because before the First World War, there was no welfare system at all. The welfare system emerges because of political pressure during the war of the workers themselves, saying, hey, we're getting slaughtered in the trenches, we're working extra hours, and we need to survive. Actually, the welfare state was mostly because you needed to maintain your workers alive if you wanted to win the war. That was the reason why the capitalist state decided to actually give in and give something to the workers, which is what I described in the first chapter of my book, The Capital Order. But the point here being that after the First World War, you see austerity more clearly just because a welfare state had been kind of started to be enacted, right? And so you see the state cutting it. So in the UK, we had the Geddes Axe. The Geddes Axe came into place in 1922. It was actually a bigger cut in social expenditures than what Thatcher did in the 80s, okay? So it was a huge blow to the whole fervor of social democracy, welfarism, even the most moderate type of the Ministry of Reconstruction. And that moment really was very visible. You could see austerity. People just lost all the security they had. You saw it when the Bank of England increased interest rates and all of a sudden unemployment skyrocketed. And that's how they stopped strikes from happening. Actually, it's very interesting to look at the data. The Bank of England increases interest rates in April 1920. In less than a year, 1921, the insured workforce there was a 17% unemployment rate. And if you look at the data, that's the moment in which unionization starts dropping, strikes collapse. So all of the mobilization of the previous 2 years is dead. So it worked, you increased market dependence, you increased unemployment, you made workers lose their bargaining power, plus a good dosage of industrial austerity, privatizations, cutting of labor rights. This is what the state does to protect capitalism. So you know what I mean? State and the market, they've always gone hand in hand. And this is what the state primarily does. Then the state can also maybe offer something, if you're lucky in certain states, to the very, very poor. But these are crumbs with respect to where the real resources of our tax money and the value we produce goes in protecting the two pillars, especially the private investors.
Let's talk about some Italian economists. Okay. There's a great guy. Well, he's not so great. I like the name, though. Maffeo Pantaleoni. He said in 1920 that workers live like pigs in their homes in order to waste the greatest part of their income on wine at the tavern. So he's one of four economists that you highlight as supporting Mussolini. Another one is Luigi Einaudi. These are effectively liberal economists.
Pantaleoni was fascist by ideology, but Einaudi is a big deal because he becomes the first supposedly anti-fascist president of the Republic after the fall of Mussolini in 1945. Okay, so in 1940, after the war is over, Einaudi is our president of the Republic, recycled as an anti-fascist. He, as you mentioned, was very much in bed with fascism.
There's four fascist economists, or they were economists that aided Mussolini. Two are sort of card-carrying fascists, as I understand it, and then two are sort of liberals. Regardless, who are these people? So Pantaleoni is one, Einaudi is another, and you mentioned two others. And what's this relationship between the liberal economic policies they want and their support for Mussolini?
Yeah, that's the whole thing, is that liberal economic policies still today are really like a nice way to say austerity. Austerity is barely used as a word because people saw how much it destroyed their lives after 2008. Again, a moment in which the state spent all it could to 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 de-risk and save those private investors, and people lost everything, right? And the UK really suffered. Since then, your mortality, the age of people in which people die, had actually lowered because
Yeah.
of these austerity policies. So literally, austerity kills. Um, um, so liberal policies are austerity, and austerity is what united these fascist and liberal economists, because they were all exponents of neoclassical economics, of what at the time was called pure economics, which again made a lot of sense. The idea was that value was not produced by the worker. It was actually coming out of the capacity of the entrepreneur to save and invest. There were no longer classes in their model or conflicts. There was only harmony in individuals. And value had nothing to do with unpaid labor and exploitation. Value had all to do with abstinence of the select few. So in this model, of course, what you need to do is discipline workers and incentivize investors. So austerity follows directly from these models. And in fact, it's what capitalism needs to work, because if workers get more, they might ask for more, they might subvert the relation of exploitation, and this is a huge problem. And so I think it's important to note how really, fascism and liberalism share a lot more than what is usually said.
Does there need to be a reckoning by and from liberals about this relationship between liberalism, liberal economic theory, and fascism? I remember reviewing a book by a guy in this country called Ian Dunt. He's a liberal in this country, Romaniac, big EU guy, he thinks he's a progressive person, whatever. And he wrote this book about the history of liberalism. And it didn't include, the role of people like John Locke in the slave trade. It didn't talk about the fact that, slavery in Europe basically disappears until the emergence of these modern liberal capitalist states, the Dutch Republic, Britain, obviously then the United States as well. I think Jean Baudin talks about it, this French legal theorist. Slavery disappears, and in our own time, we see it come back. Right? Why is it coming back? Kind of weird. Well, it's because people were commodities for exchange, which only exists really under capitalism. Park that because, of course, hundreds of years ago. But the stuff you're talking about is only a century ago. And it's not just in Italy either. You've got it in Chile. You've got it in Germany. Again, I think it was Zentrum, the centrist party in Germany. They were fine with Hitler taking power. They were fine. Yeah. So you repeatedly see it, this kind of either an active partnership or, active indifference. Yeah. Between the liberal centre and fascism. Now, I know this sounds like ultra-leftist talking points. I'm being sort of sectarian to people who are more centrist than I am. This is just the historical record.
Happens over and over in Latin America, even with Boris Yeltsin in Russia. I mean, the whole point is that you needed to enforce this this commodification and plunder of the whole Russian economy to open to the market. And it was all, Larry Summers was writing on The Economist. Of course, Boris Yeltsin had to bomb his own parliament. I mean, there were no other options because there was a crazy radical majority that was not letting him pass the austerity reforms. So he called the three reforms: privatization, liberalization, and I don't know what the other one was, but it was the same, the same stuff. So this happens, as you say, over and over again. Yes, this is the whole point, because liberalism is capable of hiding the economic coercion that is at the foundation of the type of economic system they support, because of how actually capitalism presents itself. And this is important. What is specific about capitalism is this thing by which, given that coercion is at the surface just economic, you don't see it because technically people are free to choose whether they want to get employed by Starbucks or McDonald's, right? There is this is what economists focus on, like the choice of the individual, that apparently and we're all equal, supposedly, right? The employer is a consumer and we are just selling our capacity to work for the employer, and we are somehow on an equal plane at the level of the market. What is missing here is the fact that actually this is just this is just an illusion because, the freedom of the market is based on this fundamental freedom of where you stand in these relations of production. And that's what the liberalism thrives on, right? Liberalism thrives on the idea that actually market and freedom are synonymous. But that's because they're blind to what really matters under capitalism, which is the relation of exploitation. And then when this relation of exploitation is being questioned, that's when, their mask falls. That's when they say, well, you gotta guess what? I guess we have priorities. Are we going to be about freedom of expression or protecting private property? I guess we're going to be about protecting private property and making sure the wage relation doesn't fall. So then in certain occasions, this has to happen through a brutal military regime. And this has happened over and over in the history of capitalism. So I think this is the whole point, is that they thrive on what is indeed a peculiarity of capitalism, which is this supposed economic impersonal laws forcing us, which is, it's less strong than in the feudal or slavery system in which you knew who your exploiter was. It was clear that the person had no agency and that they were completely subordinate. Under feudalism, you would extract the labor of your serf through law, through military force. So it was very obviously political, right? You knew what the problem was. Under capitalism is much more subtle, right? It's the impersonal laws of the market that supposedly function on their own. So you can't point the finger to any specific employer because if that's just how the system operates. So this is important. Liberalism thrives on that because then they confuse this impersonal coercion with supposed freedom. But really, things become much clearer when the foundation for their economy is being questioned. And that's when they have to side with fascism if they don't want to end up in a potential post-capitalist economy. And so, yes, I think this is the whole point, is that liberals can't really be for economic democracy. You can't be a liberal and be for economic democracy because economic democracy requires the elimination of the very principles you base your whole belief system on. And I think this is crucial, is that we need to realize that capitalism and democracy can't go together. And if liberalism is based in a capitalist economy, liberalism is just as authoritarian as fascism when it comes to questioning the foundation of their belief system.
So I think, again, some people might be watching this thinking, this is crazy, you're comparing liberalism to fascism. Or you're saying that the system we live in, this lovely system, Aaron, you have an iPhone, you have your Novara Media t-shirt, you can get it at shop.novaramedia.com. Very, very ethical supply chains, trade unions. You're selling your book. We're all selling commodities, right? To live, by the way. And they would say, this is ridiculous. You're comparing it to feudalism. But I remember, going through Robert Nozick as a university undergraduate. Here we go. Oh my God, I'm triggered. Robert Nozick, a libertarian political philosopher. And of course, this whole idea about the economy being a series of ultra-voluntaristic relations you enter into. And, one of the great confounding counter-arguments with that was, in terms of understanding the wage relation, in terms of selling your labor to an employer, well, if you're in the desert and you've not drunk water for 3 days and you're on the verge of death, you have, some gold rings, you have some valuable things, but of course you're about to die from dehydration. It's all meaningless to you. And somebody comes along with a bottle of water and they say, I will swap all of your worldly possessions. You have to indenture yourself to me for the next 50 years. Your house back home in London, you have to give it to me. All of that for this one bottle of water. You're going to do it. Now, on the surface, that's a consensual transaction, right? It's exactly the same with wage labor. Yeah, you consent to the wage labor. If you don't do it, you die.
Exactly.
The one thing worse than having a shit job under capitalism is having no job under capitalism, right? Because you can't reproduce the basics of your own life.
That is exactly it.
Anyway, I always love that argument against Robert Nozick.
That is exactly it, is that this fundamental abstraction of analytic political philosophy and economics is the same, right? You are completely blind to the fundamental historic conditions in which these decisions are being taken in the first place. If you focus just on the individual decision making, you're missing what really matters, which is exactly what you're saying, which is the context and the positioning of people and what is the compulsion that they're under. So they might not be under explicit political compulsion like under feudalism, but they're definitely under even a stronger compulsion, which is the economic compulsion. By the way, under feudalism, serfs had their own means of production. That's why the lord had to extract politically, because they otherwise, why should they give, given that they could reproduce themselves? The whole point is that economic compulsion is even stronger in a way, because that's the thing, like, you don't even need force to go against you. You'll do it anyway, right? Because you've lost those means of subsistence. And this is the market dependence that austerity policies have to maintain in place. Without market dependence, there would be no exploitation. We would not be under capitalism, because people would find very more interesting things to do than to go work for shitty wages to enrich the very, very few people. And especially right now, in which we know that the big corporations are all benefiting from the genocide, not just in Palestine, but also in Sudan, the silent genocide no one speaks about. Many places, I mean, the military economy is the way in which the shareholder profit grows. And this is something that I think right now more than ever, we need to be able to say, capitalism and humanity just don't fit together. The ecological collapse is very real. This is not a joke. Like, we have, in the first 10 days of the year, the 0.1% of the population had already overshot what their CO emissions to remain within the limits to avoid just disastrous global warming.
1.5 degrees plus, right?
And yes, in the first 10 days, right? So this is the thing, is that it's not just that the wealthy are enriching themselves, they're also unsustainably producing the climate catastrophe that hits, at the end of the day, mostly the poor and the people in the global south, who have no real responsibility in producing these terrible effects on the climate because of the production for profit.
You said a bit earlier about if you don't understand history, then you have a sort of fetishization of the present. That's all you kind of understand, which I think that's really core to liberalism, actually, is this idea that there is no past, there is no future. Everything's just this very flat present.
Yes.
And this is really talked about very well, actually, by conservative thinkers, people like Patrick Deneen, who I don't agree with on very much in terms of policies, reproductive rights, etc., etc. But in terms of understanding temporality and your relationship to time under liberalism, like, he's completely correct. And you said about history and how we need to repoliticize history. There's that quote, isn't it? I think it's from you say Cicero, I say Cicero. It's Cicero, it's Cicero, about Storia Magister Est, right? About, like, history is the great teacher, and I think for people on the left, that is absolutely correct. It is the great teacher, and I'm going to mention a historical figure which most people won't have heard of. There's a guy called Alfred Sohn-Rethel, who's a sort of Marxist. Maybe you heard of this guy? Very marginal guy. He's written 2 books that are really, really great. I think one was only translated into English very recently. The other one hasn't been. I might be wrong. And he has this great point. He says that it's only since the 1870s that the reproduction of life becomes becomes contingent on the reproduction of capitalism. Before then, which is your point, right? Under feudalism, you have the commons. Workers could reproduce their life outside of the commodity relation, outside of wage labor. We can no longer do it. That's a really new thing. We've been around for 300,000 years. Yes. The idea that, and it's true, right? Well, there's no possibility of anything beyond capitalism, because without capitalism, we'd all die. Like, that assertion is so recent.
Yes.
And so historically contingent.
Yes.
And if you don't realize that, then of course alternatives are implausible. You said something about capitalism and democracy can't coexist. Let's talk about that for a minute.
Yes.
Because that's a big statement, right?
Yes. It's what I try to tackle at the end of the book, in chapter 5. I qualify, like, liberal democracy comes hand in hand with the modern state and with the capitalist economy. But it's a farce. I mean, liberal democracy is a farce. It's reducing people to passive consumers who get to choose, again, a very individualistic framework, who is going to govern for them, but have completely relinquished any say on the decisions that really matter, which are the decisions about how we produce, what, why, and when. This is completely taken away from them, right? That's done by few private investors, always fewer, that are like, again, extracting profit through the super exploitation of the majority of people and resources on the planet. So this is the whole point, is that liberal democracy is very much coherent with what we've discussed, which is this fundamental economic unfreedom that you do not see because supposedly we are politically free, right? So liberal democracy tells us we are politically free. We can all go vote, and all, like those lucky ones that have, the citizenship in a country. But really, it's masking what really matters is that no, we're deeply economically unfree, actually, because all of our agency is taken away from us daily when we relate to our employer, but also in terms of the public policy decisions. Like, austerity is there. No one would vote for austerity, actually, if they understood what austerity was. Of course, they represent austerity to us as the way to live within our means, as the way to cure the debt problem and all of that. The virtuous household metaphor. If people realize that austerity is really about taking resources from people to benefit the very, very few and just increase the hardship of their life, no one would be favorable to austerity. That's why you need independent institutions. That's what the ECB, the UK, all of these Western countries have implemented and are forcing on and have forced on the south of the globe for centuries through the structural adjustment programs of the IMF, which are just another form of austerity. So that's the whole thing. You need to shield people from economic participation, because people would reject what economists consider the objective solutions. People would reject the privatization, the increases in interest rates, would reject the things that make their life shittier. And they reject it because it's against the logic of need. And this is the whole point, is that the logic of need and the logic of profit are in contrast with one another. People usually instinctively go by the logic of need, but this is irrational for the logic of profit. So what economists are trained to do, and I've gone through the whole brainwashing situation doing the PhD, is to train their minds to think according to the logic of profit. And this is catastrophic, because then we are delegating the experts, those who have the PhD, so they know it, they're smart, they understand. We're delegating to them the most essential decisions that actually shape our daily lives. And this is what we need to change. We need to understand that the economics is political, that actually we need to take charge of things that matter most. And it's not just voting for whoever the puppet is that runs the government. Well, the interests represented are always the same. It's actually about taking charge. And with the Forum for Real Economic Emancipation, the FREE, this is what we're trying to experiment with, because I'm sick and tired of a lot of my colleagues who just, act like they're all critical about capitalism, maybe also write nice books, and then they're just like enjoying their privilege as academics. We are amongst the few remaining middle class exponents, if you like to use that. We need to actually, I think, be coherent, and that's why, like, for me, the FREE is so important. Is that I wrote a book, but I realized that to be coherent, I also need to participate and try out something different. And, the forum for me is a space, we do public education. We have our podcast, our YouTube channel, freeforum.org. You can see it. But the point is that we're also practicing alternative institution building. And it's not easy, because we've lost capacity to organize democratically. We've lost capacity to partake in collective decision. And it's really a challenge, but I'm learning so much. I'm seeing how difficult it is to be effective and democratic, but also how important it is, because people re-flourish. Like, you see, like me including, like, you get out of an assembly, you feel alive. You feel like you've actually, like, even if it was like 2 decisions that you took collectively and they're not that important, the very process itself is what makes us human. The fact that we are actually engaging in collective deliberation that we've completely lost capacity to do, because our economic system does not want us to do collective deliberation. It wants us only to think about buying shoes or food after we take in our paycheck after having worked for someone else. This is all we're reduced to. I mean, if we're lucky, we have kids and we bring the kids to the park or have a pet or whatever. But the point is that the process of sitting in an assembly and taking decisions as a group and trying to see how you can actually get more space for market independence, more space for actual real economic emancipation, that I think is really powerful. It's difficult, it's small, but you start small. And I think There are lots of stuff happening in the world. It's not just the free. You have many alternatives out there. Rojava, you have the Zapatista movement. You have a lot of stuff that are never discussed in mainstream debates because they're terrifying for the system, because they do exist. They try to survive in a world of enemies, but it is possible. As humans, we can be democratic in a real sense. The point is that we need to try it out. And so this is the reason why I'm in Tulsa. Tulsa is actually much nicer than one might think, is because I think I'm learning by doing. And this is the best way to remain real to Gramsci. Gramsci, I named my child Antonio, the new one I just had, because Gramsci has been a real he's the scholar I learned most from. And the reason I learned so much from Gramsci was because he was not just writing, his prison notebooks, what he's famous for. He wrote them in prison after Mussolini put him to prison. He dies in prison. But those notebooks were the outcome of reflection of a whole journey he had done with the councils, the factory councils, in 1919, 1920. He was part of the councils. He was working with the workers. He was not a worker. He's a student in philosophy, so he was more of an intellectual. But the intellectual without the worker meant nothing. He came up with the idea of the organic intellectuals. As we are, most of us are, without wanting to, organic intellectuals of the bourgeoisie, because we relate, to the privileged structure. So the only way to not be organic intellectuals of the bourgeoisie is, I think, to try to associate through these assemblies that are by definition made up of people who really suffer in this economy and who see the shit show that this economic system is producing. So that's what that's what I'm doing right now. And it's the only way to not get depressed, honestly. Like with the genocide in Gaza, I could not sleep at night. Having kids and realizing where my tax money was going was devastating. So the only way I can, maintain my humanity is to say, well, let's try it out. It's nice to write books, but, this takes you in the route of maybe you become known and then you like your fame and then you think you're the most important thing around. The reality is that we are important if we act collectively. And so I think this is a lesson I'm learning. And I hope assemblies like the Free can flourish in other places. There's so much interest. We've grown. We started in July. We had 400 people in the last event that came. And the assembly is growing day to day. And we're trying to structure ourselves through circles to be more effective with holacracy structure. So different circles that coordinate with one another. It's difficult, but it's interesting.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about having kids for me is that you just realize how much bullshit it all is. It's my birthday soon. And, my wife says, what do you want for your birthday? Literally don't care. I couldn't care less. So this whole idea of a post-materialist mindset, it wasn't because, I achieved Zen. It's because there's this other life out there that is so much more meaningful to me than any bullshit you can buy from Marks and Spencer or John Lewis. That's one thing. And I think that's something people really need to think about, because right now family life is coded as kind of a right-wing thing. And actually, I couldn't disagree more. Finally, you're talking about alternatives. There's one alternative you're not talking about. China.
I agree.
China's not in the book much.
Yes.
And I'm thinking, this is really interesting because you're talking about organic intellectuals. The Chinese Communist Party, if you look at the story of Deng and Mao, these were organic intellectuals. And they've created, clearly it's a market society, clearly, but it's also clearly a very different kind of market society to the one we have in the West. What are your views on China, just quickly, and where does it fit within this broader analysis?
So I think China's not much in the book because I feel like I haven't studied and learned enough about China. So I didn't feel like I had the capacity to really dig into that. But I do think that the point is that the reason why everyone's so scared about China is that it is a different model in many ways. Now, we know that it's still based on relations of exploitation, but there is a way in which there is a political moderation of the logic of profit. I mean, there is, and this is because the party is, as you say, organically connected to the base. And this is a an understanding of the party that is something that we have lost or maybe never had in the West, right? The idea that the party is actually really ingrained at all levels in society. And this is the way in which then the party does become representative. Sure, it's one party, but I mean, at the end of the day, substantially, you are able to collect much more diversity because of this connectedness to the ground. So I think what's interesting there is that you see that if there is the political will, you can tame private investors and you can achieve some objectives that are not necessarily mediated by the profit motive. And this is why China has been capable of eradicating a lot of poverty like no capitalist society has ever done. This is the reason why they're actually, cutting edge in terms of ecological, sustainable past, is because they're, and again, I don't want to idealize. I have many colleagues. I have a colleague of mine who's actually writing a book about like the contradictions of the ecological policies in China, again because of this thing. They've shown that it is possible to overcome the logic of profit, but it's also the case that this is a constant tension, and this is something that I think requires exploration. And I hope to be able. They're translating my other book in China, so I hope to be able to actually go and learn more about this. Definitely, I think the fact that there's so much taboo talk is a good sign because it tells us that there's a lot also that we could learn as alternatives that are meant to be kept away from us.
Clara, been great to talk to you. When you have the next book, maybe it includes China, we'll have you back on.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure. And if you can, follow the freeforum.org. It would be great. Thank you.